verse 21 and verse 22. And in verse 21, it says, idamaham pada abhikyaman vaham. So this self, which is indicated by the word aham, when anu aham, when that individual ego, when that dissolves or when that gets falsified, what happens? Ahamilinake api, the total I also merges with it. And it's alaya sattaya, means it is that sat which is indestructible. There's no laya to it. So somebody might say, okay, this ego was falsified, but what about this whole world that I'm seeing? So when the ego, the individual ego, anu aham, when that gets dissolved, the totality also gets dissolved with it. So like when we go to deep sleep, that individual I goes to sleep, so that experience of the total world, that also goes to sleep. So this is what he says in verse 21. And then in verse 22, he says, okay, now how do we really do this inquiry? How do we really do it to differentiate ourselves from everything that is the not self? So he says, Vigrahendriya pranadhi tamaha na. So I am not the vigraha, the body, the indriyas, the prana, the dhi, the intellect, or tamaha, or that ignorance. No, I am ekasat. I am just that one existence. Why? Tat jadam, they're all inert and therefore they are asat. So we went through this whole equation that why are they asat, or why do we say they're unreal? We say that because they are seen. They are seen. So the first part is yadrishyam, they are seen. Therefore, whatever is seen is inert. Whatever is seen, whatever is experienced is inert because it depends on something else to illuminate, right? So you might say, but you see me, but you see my body. What you really see is my body. My body is inert. So therefore, this is inert. And therefore, this is seen, this is inert, and this is perishable. What's inert is perishable. So yadrishyam tajjanam tam nashwaram. And what is perishable is what we call mithya. It's only apparent because sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there. And therefore we call it asat. So all these things that are changing, that are inert, that are perishable, all these things are the not self. They're completely different from the self. And these things are the body, the mind, the ego. All of these things are the not self. So he says, make this distinction between the two and keep doing it. Keep doing it. Then now today we're going to see verse number 23. So I will chant and then you can repeat. Sattvabhasika chikvavetara sattaya hi chit chittaya hyaham. Sattvabhasika chitkvavetara sattaya hi chit chittaya hyaham. So he says sattva bhasika. First, how are we coming to this verse? Because it says that, okay, all of this is mithya. Whatever's the not self, we said is mithya. And therefore, the only truth is that existence consciousness. But is it two things? Is it existence and consciousness, or is it one thing? What is it exactly? So here, Bhagavan Ramana Maharishi, he clarifies everything. He says that sattva bhasika, which means the illuminator of existence, chit kwa va itara chit means is it other than consciousness? That illuminator of existence, is it other than consciousness? And he says, sattaya hi chit, that existence alone is consciousness, and chittaya hi aham, and that consciousness is me. So here he clarifies that really, even if we say sat chit ananda, they're not three things. Sat, Chit, Ananda are not three things. And Sat, Chit, Ananda are not properties of the self. Sat, Chit, and Ananda are the nature of the self. And they are the nature of the self, and they are just words indicating the self. Because very beautifully, as Gurudev has put in his talks, the pointer can never reach the pointed. The pointer is just an indicator. So if I'm pointing there, I'm not touching the wall. I'm just pointing towards it. So these words, Sat, Chit, and Ananda, are just pointers. They're indicators, but they cannot touch the pointed. And they are the nature of the self. Why are we using three terms? When we take a look at the word Sat, this Sat negates everything that is changing. So when you use the word Sat, it's just negating everything that's changing. It's coming from that standpoint. When we use the word Chit, it is negating everything that is inert. So it's coming from that standpoint. And when we use Ananda, it is negating everything that is finite, because Ananda means infinite. It means one. It means beyond space, beyond time, beyond causation. So it's negating everything that's finite. So these things we will find in Taittiriya Upanishad, right? So these are not really three different things. They're one thing, but they're indicating from three different ways. So when you think of Sat and Chit, when we look at Shruti, when we examine things, we always do it three ways, right? First is Shruti, next is Yukti, next is Anubhuti. Shruti means the scriptures. Yukti means logic. Anubhuti means my own personal experience. In our Upanishads, it says that this self is Sat, it's Chit, it's Ananda. It says in Taittiriya Upanishad, many Upanishads, it calls it as maybe Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. Now we look at logic. If really consciousness and existence were different from each other, what would happen? So if we had existence here and consciousness here, and they were different from each other, what would happen? Existence is called Sat. So that consciousness would be different from existence, right? It would be different. Then it would be non-existence, right? So that can't be, because consciousness exists. So it cannot be different from it, because if it would be different from existence, it would be non-existent. And clearly we know that we are of the nature of awareness. Next, if we take existence and consciousness here and we say, okay, consciousness is here, existence is here, and existence is different from consciousness. It's not consciousness. If existence is different from consciousness, what happens? Then it has to be opposite of consciousness, which is inertness. Existence would have to be inert. And we've learned that whatever is inert is perishable. And whatever is perishable is actually mithya. It is apparent. But then we know that there is this changeless existence. We know it. So therefore, this existence cannot be different from consciousness, because it would be inert. So when we logically look at it also, not just based on the scriptures, but logically looking at it, that consciousness and that existence is the same thing. Because again, if existence was there and consciousness is different from it, consciousness would be asat, or non-existence. Consciousness is there and existence is different from it, then existence would be inert, which eventually would be non-existent, because it's perishing and it's subject to distraction and it's apparent. So even logically, you cannot separate them. So from the Upanishad standpoint, they are one. Logically, they are one. And in our own experience, even if we forget everything else, Don't you feel that you are this changeless presence? Don't you feel it? That there's something in you that's changeless. You feel it, right? It's your own experience that so many things have changed, that there's something there changeless. Maybe you can't point out what it is. Maybe there's no deep understanding of it, but we know it's there. We know that there's something changeless there. And that changeless presence is an awareness. We're aware of it. It's not that I am here and somebody has to tell me I am here. When I say I am, it means I'm here, I exist, and I know I exist. I'm aware of it. Nobody has to tell me that I exist. Nobody has to show me I exist. I intuitively know it. So even if we take out everything, if we don't even look at scriptures, don't look at logic, just study your experience. That's all. You will see that there is something in me that's not changing. There's something in me that's that awareness. What is that? That is aham. That sat is chit, and that chit is aham. It is my real nature. And that's what he wants to get at. So he says, what is left when you negate the not self, you negate all of the not self, what is left is the self. And that self is of the nature of sat, is of the nature of chit. And that is me. And you can see it from scriptures, from logic, and your own intuitive experience. Now, he says, but some people will say, what about God? What about the God? You're telling me, okay, this is my nature. But what about God? So then, anticipating that, he goes into verse number 24. Isha jivayor veshadhivida satsvabhavato vastu kevalam. Isha jivayor veshadhivida satsvabhavato vastu kevalam. So he says here, what does he say? Isha jiva yoho, between Isha, between God and Jiva and individual, veshadhivida. The difference is only the vesha, the costume. The difference is the costume, the body and the intellect, the gross body and the subtle body. Sat swabhavataha, from the standpoint of their absolute nature, sat swabhavataha, vastu kevalam. That alone is supreme reality, means the essence of them alone is supreme reality. So from the standpoint of the gross and subtle equipment, there's a difference between Jiva and Ishwara. But from the standpoint of their true nature, supreme reality alone is. So each of these verses are really beautifully packed, if we really think about them. So first, before we see the difference between Jiva and Ishwara, first let's analyze what is Jiva and what is Ishwara. Okay? When we talk about Jiva, so Jiva means individual. In Gurudev's BMI chart, Jiva is PFT, perceiver, feeler, thinker. Or Jiva can also sometimes be called ego. So all of these things are Jiva. Jiva, individuality, perceiver, feeler, thinker, doer, enjoyer, ego, all of this is Jiva. What is this Jiva? When consciousness is associated with the individual conditionings, that is called Jiva. Okay? What are the individual conditionings? Individual conditionings, we have seen 3 bodies. You can say 3 bodies or 5 sheets. For now, I'm just going to go with the three bodies. The three bodies are the gross body. So we know this whole thing is a gross body, the subtle body, the pranas, the jnanendriyas, organs of knowledge, the karmendriyas, organs of action, actual faculties. Then we have the mind, the intellect, memory, and ego. This is a subtle body. Then the causal body is what we call avidya or ignorance. So this we saw in Tattva Bodha. We saw also in Atma Bodha. So when that consciousness is associated with this whole three bodies, that is called Jiva. That is called Jiva. So consciousness plus individual conditionings, gross, subtle, causal body, Jiva. Now, what is Ishwara? That same consciousness plus total gross bodies, total subtle body, total causal body. So when we say total gross body, so just think of all the bodies that you can possibly think of. And even if you can't think of that body, that's also Ishwara. From the ant to the fish, to the snake, to the frog, to the humans, all total bodies is Ishwara. The entire total mind and total intellect, that is also Ishwara. The total vasanas, that is also Ishwara. So that consciousness associated with totality, that is called God. The totality in the gross aspect, in the subtle aspect, and in the causal aspect. And the difference between Jiva and Ishwara, we know, is Jiva is Maya Dasa. Jiva is a slave of Maya, is bound by Maya. But this Ishwara is Maya Pati. This Ishwara is the ruler, controller of Maya, wields Maya. So when we look at Jiva and Ishwara, there's a real difference we see in terms of their Vesha, in terms of the gross body, the subtle body, and causal body. One is individual, one is total. If we look at their qualities also, it's very different, because we say that Jiva is Alpagnya. Alpagnya means knows very, very little. Whereas this Ishwara is Sarvagnya, all-knowing. Why do we say Ishwara is all-knowing? Because Ishwara is that which is associated with the total mind, total intellect, total vasanas. So obviously Ishwara knows everything, because Ishwara is associated with totality. That means everyone's mind, everyone's intellect, everyone's vasana, even that which is unmanifest is known to Ishwara. Even that which has not expressed is known to Ishwara. And how do we say that Ishwara is all-powerful? We are Alpa Shakti. We are only limited by this body. But Ishwara is that which is in all the gross bodies. So you can understand that Ishwara is Sarva Shakti, is the one who is all-powerful. It's got all strength. So that is how we say that God is all-knowing, all-powerful. That is why we say that God is everywhere, because God is actually consciousness expressing in totality of everything. So we say God is everywhere. God is in everything. God is there all the time, because God is consciousness expressing in all totality. That Jiva is just consciousness expressing in this individuality. So what happens here is that much is the difference. The difference is in the Vesha, and the difference is in the conditioning. Another Vesha also means costume. So it's as though he's saying the difference is in the costume. But if you take away these three bodies, right? Consciousness plus individual three bodies is Jiva. Consciousness plus total three bodies is Ishvara. If you take away those three bodies, in essence, what is there? it's consciousness, satsvabhavaha, right? It's just consciousness existence that's there. And so from the absolute standpoint, really, Jiva and Ishwara are one. And this is what our Mahavakyas try to tell us, is that you, the essence of you and the essence of God are really one. There's really no difference. And the perfect example for this is the ocean and the waves, which we've seen before, right? The wave is so small, right? The wave is Alpa Shakti, barely can do anything. This wave cannot cause a tsunami or anything like that, nothing like that. And this wave is just very limited. But when you look at the ocean, it's vast. It is huge. It is Sarva Shakti. It can do a lot of things, this ocean. It can house animals. Animals can live in an ocean. Animals cannot live in a wave, right? It's Sarva Shakti. It's Sarvagnya. It's huge. But really, so you look at the wave and you look at the ocean, yeah, on the surface level, they appear really different. But go deep. What's inside the wave and inside the ocean? It's just water. The wave is just a name and form. The ocean is just a name and form. But inside, they're just water. So the difference between God and the individual is just the Vesha. That's all. There's nothing more to it. So here he says, Isha Jiva Yor Veshadhi Bida Satswabhavahato Vastu Kevalam. From the standpoint of their true nature, that consciousness alone is. Now, we will maybe just do one more. We will get into this a little bit. Verse number 25. Veshahanata swatmadarshanam Ishadarshanam swatmarupataha Veshahanataha swatmadarshanam Ishadarshanam swatmarupataha. Okay, so now I will just introduce this verse. What happens? What happens when you remove the veshas, the conditionings? Veshahanataha, to one who gives up or removes the conditionings, swatmadarshanam, means they have the vision of the self. And that vision of the self is Isha Darshana. That vision of the self is the vision of God. Swatmarupataha, as the self. So what it says here is, many times people will say, but I want the vision of God. I want God realization. But what is really God realization? In this verse, it makes it so clear that God realization is self-realization. To the one who's able to falsify these veshas, body, mind, intellect, they get the vision of their absolute self, which is Atma. And that vision of the self, that is the vision of God. That is the exact same thing. The vision of the self and the vision of God is the exact same thing. And this is the vision reality. There's one beautiful phrase that one of the Swamis said before, and it was written there: God and man met, and both of them said to each other, meet my creator. So when you look at Jiva, the individual, right? Only when I am Jiva, then there's going to be Ishwara. Only when I consider myself to be Jiva, then there's going to be an Ishwara. And only when Ishwara considers Ishwara to be Ishwara, then there's going to be Jiva. Only when there's a wave, then there's going to be ocean. Only when there's an ocean, there's going to be wave. But if we just get into water, then that is the absolute essence of everything. So, and I think I had mentioned this before. It's like somebody had asked Bhagavan Ramana Maharishi, does this God have a form, or is this God formless? And he said, well, do you have a form, or are you formless? So when we see ourselves with form, we will see God with form. We will want to see God with form. We will long to see God with form. But when we see ourselves without form, then that God is also without form. We see God in God's utter essence, without the vesha, without the costume. That's the vision of reality. Okay? So more about this vision and how to really get to this vision, we will take up in the next class. Okay?